Hello and welcome. My name is Mahalet Gatacho, and I'm the Managing Director of Corporate Racial Equity at PolicyLink. I'm joined today by several of my partners and colleagues at PolicyLink, Just Capital, and FSG, who I'll introduce in just a moment. On behalf of the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance team, I'm so thrilled to welcome you to the launch of our second public comment period, where we have the privilege of inviting your experience and insight into our corporate standards development process. As you know, the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance has embarked on a multi-year journey to develop rigorous corporate performance standards on racial and economic equity, focused on the US to start and with an eye on the global context. Today, we've published a report detailing our approach and methodology to standards development, everything from the guiding principles behind our work to the outcomes we're striving for and the structure of the standards. Today's session will provide an introduction, an overview of the report, and we're inviting you to share your feedback to strengthen our work as we move forward. This is a huge milestone for us in our work, and we're so excited for you to be here taking this next step with us. Now, we could not have gotten here without the support of so many colleagues, partners, and funders. There's a big team with us, and we won't get to introduce everybody today, but we do want to thank all of those who have supported and helped shape our work to date. We'll share more gratitude towards the close of our time together as well. Now, before we get started, I'd like to share some housekeeping notes with you all. We're fortunate today to be joined by Lori Espinoza, who is providing Spanish language interpretation in a separate channel. To access Spanish interpretation, please press the globe at the bottom of your computer screen and select Spanish. If you're joining from a phone, press the three dots at the bottom right of your screen and then select Spanish in the chat. Lori is now actually going to post in the chat some instructions in Spanish, so please check that out. I'm going to pause for a moment just to ensure everyone who would like to join the Spanish translation channel can find Lori. All right, closed captioning is also available today. To access it, click the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. And please note that the chat channel is closed for attendees. We invite you to submit your questions, though, to us through the Q&A function at any time throughout the webinar. We'll get to as many questions as we can and during the Q&A portion at the end. And for those questions that we just can't get to, we'll make sure to address them through FAQs that will be available on our website soon. And finally, we're recording this webinar and it will be shared with all registrants along with the slides via email after the event. All right, let's get to the next slide to check out our agenda. We're covering 5 topics today. First, we'll provide an overview of the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance, including our vision, mission, and the goals of our work. Next, we'll share a rationale for developing corporate performance standards on racial and economic equity. We'll then provide an overview of our development process thus far, and after that, we'll dive into the heart of our work, the scope and structure of the standards. At last, we'll provide an overview of the public comment period that launches today and how you can get involved to help shape the standards for equity in business. We expect to have around 8 minutes or so for Q&A at the end, so don't forget to submit your questions along the way. Now I'd like to go to the next slide to share who our speakers are for today. We're joined by Michael McAfee, President and CEO of PolicyLink, Greg Hills, CEO of FSG, Martin Whitaker, CEO of Just Capital, Ashley Marchand Orme, Director of Corporate Equity at Just Capital, Kendra Berenson, Associate Director at FSG, and AJ Scott, Senior Consultant at FSG. Now, before we dive into our agenda, I want to bring Michael, Greg, and Martin into the room with us. They're each going to share a bit about why this work is so important to each of our organizations and our collective aspirations. Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Mahalet. Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here today. I'm excited to be here today because, the founding of our nation extended an invitation to all of us. And that invitation is for us to continue to perfect our democracy. And we think one way that we can continue to perfect our democracy is to strengthen our economy. And when we think about strengthening our economy, we often think about those left behind, those still requiring support to move into the middle class and beyond. And as we go through today, as you think about corporate standards, I want you to think about the nearly 100 million plus in this nation who are struggling to make ends meet, 48 million of whom are white. That's our opportunity. That's our work. The economy needs to be optimized for that group. And this is an unparalleled moment. All three sectors have come to racial equity: corporate America, civil society, and government at every level. And because of that, we think we need to seize this moment by making sure that as leaders come to racial equity, there is a North Star for how you do this work in a results-based way, not a performative way, but in ways that will be real, that will make a difference to that 100 million. And that's why the corporate standards are so important to PolicyLink. We want to make sure that as equity becomes ubiquitous, it does not get watered down, that it ultimately becomes the North Star for how we govern in this country and how we ensure that our democracy and our economy are strong and they're enduring, and that they see the humanity of folks who have often been left behind. We can have a strong economy and a strong citizenry. That's our charge, and that's why I'm excited about this work. It is the type of enduring work that will ensure, as generations come behind us, that they have a strong foundation to stand on, a strong North Star for figuring out how to conduct business in a way that strengthens our economy, strengthens our environment, ensures that that number, that 100 million, that it actually starts going down. That's the ultimate measure of success with our standards. That's ultimately the measure of success with any journey towards racial equity. And I'm excited because I know with the energy that is behind corporate America coming to racial equity in such beautiful ways, that we're going to realize the promise of equity in our lifetime, and we're going to create a just and fair society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. So thank you for joining us today. And now I'm going to turn it to Greg.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks everyone for joining today. I'm Greg Hills, CEO of FSG. FSG is a nonprofit whose mission is to partner with corporations and foundations to create a more equitable world. I want to put this corporate racial equity work into context by bringing you back to my first day on the job at FSG. It was February 2004, over 18 years ago. I was a mid-level consultant, and on that first day, I was working on a project to advise a major pharmaceutical company on its social impact strategies. We did a lot of research and analysis, as strategy consultants do, but a glaring omission from that work was any consideration of the impacts of institutional and structural racism. We didn't consider the role of big pharma in contributing to and perpetuating inequities experienced by communities of color. Whether it's clinical trials, pricing policies, or marketing plans, none of these business strategies were analyzed to understand racial inequities and potential strategies to address them. And unfortunately, over several years, this was a common approach that FSG took in our work with our corporate clients. Now, fast forward to today, our work with corporations in the US centers racial equity. We know that structural and institutional racism are the root causes of the majority of the inequities experienced in society. We know that corporations have an outsized influence and power, either to maintain the status quo or to upend the status quo in service of a more equitable society. And we know that companies are asking for insight, for guidance, and for tools on how to achieve racial equity throughout their enterprise. This is why this corporate racial equity work is so important to me and to FSG. We know it is imperative for companies to change their mindsets, to change their behaviors in order to reduce and ultimately eliminate racial and economic inequities. This will take a concerted effort over many years, as we know, but we must act with urgency and focus today to accelerate our progress. I'm truly honored to partner with Michael and the team at PolicyLink and Martin and the team at Just Capital to advance this work. Thanks to everyone on the call for joining us in this movement. Martin, over to you.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks, Michael. It's great to be here. We're so thankful for this alliance with PolicyLink and FSG, and we're so optimistic about the impact that we can have. Just Capital is also a nonprofit. Our mission is to build a more just economy, and with that, a more just society, one that works for all Americans. And we do that by helping companies improve how they serve all their stakeholders, their workers, the communities where they operate, their customers, the environment, and their shareholders. And we are striving to ensure that racial equity is inextricably tied to our mission of building a more just and inclusive economy. And that's because the American people have told us that. That's what they want. We poll thousands of people every year on what makes a just company. And the issues that we're going to discuss today are front and center in that vision. Nearly 80% of the Americans that we've polled on a fully representative basis have told us that it's important for large companies to promote racial diversity and equity in the workplace. We're only going to realize that vision of a more just and inclusive economy if big corporations and markets decide to be a force for greater good. And that means incentives. Now, our recent research at Just has shown that companies that lead on DEI have outperformed those that don't by almost 2% over the last year. And it's those kinds of market incentives that are critical if we're to harness the innate power of the $19 trillion private sector to address systemic issues at scale. But the lack of performance standards is holding us back. Markets need information to function properly, information that they can trust. For example, only 11% of the companies in our 1,000 corporation universe even disclose an EEO-1 report, which is intersectional data on workforce demographics. So there's a long way to go. And it's clear to us, all of us, that robust standards can help market participants incentivize just business behavior and hold companies to account. And what you'll hear on this webinar is the development of corporate performance standards to help companies meaningfully engage in advancing racial equity. And we're very proud to be part of that work. Back to you, Mahalet.
Thank you, Martin. And thank you, Michael and Greg as well. As we have the slides coming back up, we're now going to share more about our vision, our mission, and how we're bringing our collective assets together toward achieving our goals. Let's go to the next slide. First, a little bit about who we are and what we bring collectively as organizations. PolicyLink is a national research and action institute advancing racial and economic equity. FSG is a mission-driven consulting firm, as you heard from Greg, guiding leaders in creating lasting social change. And Just Capital is an independent nonprofit evaluating companies on stakeholder capitalism. We all do very different things, but all towards the same vision. And together, our effort rests on more than 20 years of research and action on racial and economic inequity, more than 20 years of social sector consulting, and 8 years of tracking and analyzing the performance of companies and their investors on addressing the public's priorities. We came together over 2 years ago to produce the CEO Blueprint for Racial Equity, which is the foundation of our standards development effort, and you'll hear more about that in a little bit. Now over to our vision. We founded the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance, united by this vision of a just, equitable, and healthy society for all of us, one in which companies take comprehensive action to improve the lives of the most economically insecure among us as true champions of racial and economic equity. We believe that achieving racial and economic equity in America and beyond is a defining opportunity of our time, and that the way to do it is to focus on meeting the needs and aspirations of the most economically insecure among us. In America, as you heard from Michael, that means the nearly 100 million people living in or near poverty, most of whom are people of color. Now, civil society and government cannot do it alone. So you'll see our mission on the next page is to support companies in evolving to become anti-racist and equitable in all of their ways of operating and making decisions, so that businesses can contribute effectively to building a just, equitable, and healthy society for all of us. So how are we going to go about doing this? On the next slide, this is our model of systems change for the standards development work that we are undertaking. It starts with the future on the right, a just and equitable society. In order to get there, we need all sectors to become champions of racial and economic equity. For companies, that means deeply understanding how businesses have historically contributed to racial and economic inequities and continue to do so, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and then embedding equity in their internal and external policies and practices. Now, our effort to develop corporate performance standards aims to define for companies how to go about doing that, set the targets they should aim for, and then the ways to measure progress. Of course, we know that the harmful effects of centuries of economic inequality and systemic racism cannot be remedied by standards alone. To achieve a just and equitable society for all of us, we need sweeping interventions across sectors, including strengthening our laws and regulations and building greater leadership capacity. Nevertheless, establishing a common language and framework for businesses to advance racial and economic equity, it's a critical and urgently needed component of setting new norms for equity in business. This model of systems change is anchored in 4 things: our definition of equity, the concept of the curb cut effect, a commitment to setting new norms for equity in business and assessing corporate performance against those norms, and a belief in the broad power of stakeholder engagement to motivate meaningful corporate change. I'll now spend a few minutes on each of these and invite you all to learn much more in our report. On the next slide, we have here that equity is our guiding ethos. That's because equity is how we know we can break down barriers and unlock so much potential in our society, especially in business. It means the just and fair inclusion into a society in which all of us, not just certain groups, can fully participate, prosper, and reach our full potential. In our report, we detail how racial equity and economic equity are both processes and outcomes. We also detail how they are inextricably linked in America, as in many parts of the world. And that is why we're building corporate performance standards that encompass not just racial equity, but also economic equity. Another key component of our work is on this slide here, the curb cut effect. The concept of the curb cut effect is that targeting investments and addressing barriers that affect the most underinvested and historically excluded groups, that has the power to cascade benefits upward and outward to the well-being of all of society. Today, we may take for granted how the curb cuts and sidewalks came about. You see an image there on the slide. They were advocated for by the disability rights community in order to be able to navigate our streets. That was equity in action, and the simplest change has made it safer and easier for all of us to get around. That is why equity is so powerful. When we design the circumstances that allow those who have been left behind to participate and contribute fully, society wins. In our work, that is why we're designing standards to meet the needs and the aspirations of the 100 million people in America that experience economic insecurity. As Michael mentioned, keep in mind, it's not just people of color, it's also 25% of all white people in America and over 40% of all people of color. Total, it's 1 in 3 people in America. That is who this work is for. And as you can learn in our report, the curb cut effect shows us how equity, it's not zero sum. It's about making sure nobody is left behind in our society. So now what will these standards aim to do? Ultimately, as I've said, our work is about setting new norms for equity in business and assessing performance against those norms. We're guided by the view in this work that people of color and low-income communities, like all people, have the right to be treated equitably by all institutions in society, including businesses. The standards we are developing will support companies in understanding where there are gaps in their duties and obligations and how they can go about fulfilling those duties towards these groups in particular, but not exclusively, by providing a common standard for racial and economic equity. We'll be setting the highest bar for equity with clear thresholds of performance to achieve and measure against. We do not anticipate that many companies will hit all the high bars for performance on equity at first, but we will rally around a bold vision for equity with milestones along the way to support businesses in getting there. In sum, achieving racial and economic equity, it's not a feel-good effort for business. It's an imperative based on the rights of people of color and working class people, and the duties that all organizations have to address those rights. Now, finally, we believe in the power of broad stakeholder engagement. That's on the next slide, to motivate meaningful corporate change. This is the key to our success. Currently, only some categories of corporate stakeholders are well served or even considered by corporate reporting frameworks. Our standards aim to change that by engaging a broad array of people. We can go back just one slide, and groups, both in the development process and the design of implementation approaches. We seek not only to improve corporate behavior, but also to foster transparency and increase disclosure so that everyone can be better informed and empowered. Along with businesses, adopting the standards to set targets across the enterprise and allocate resources where it matters most. There you go, is right behind us. And it's okay, we can actually stay here. Just imagine businesses adopting these standards, then imagine investors also using the standards in their corporate engagement efforts. Imagine workers and social movement leaders using the standards to advocate for greater change. And imagine business coalitions coming together to make progress against the standards as a collective. These are just a few examples of how stakeholders will be able to leverage the standards. And we're at the perfect spot here on this slide. Now I'd like to transition to my partner and colleague, Ashley Marchand-Orme, who will walk through our rationale for corporate performance standards, a little bit more detail. Ashley.
Thank you, Mahalet. With our vision, mission, and model of systems change in mind, I will now share why we believe there's an urgent need for corporate performance standards on racial and economic equity. Next slide, please. The COVID-19 pandemic and the long overdue global reckoning on racial injustice highlighted the results of centuries of economic inequality and systemic racism. Businesses stepped up like never before with bold commitments and investments in equity. But to address systemic inequities, we need a shared language and approach for all businesses. Our rationale for developing corporate performance standards on racial and economic equity is rooted in our current circumstances, but also in our long history of instituting and upholding structural barriers, the critical role businesses play and will continue to play in society with outside influence on its economic, environmental, political, social, and cultural dimensions, widespread stakeholder demand for racial and economic equity, the value creation opportunity that equity brings to stakeholders and all of society, and the need for greater breadth and depth in corporate efforts to advance equity. Today, I will highlight just a few of these imperatives. We invite you to read more in our report about how each of these factors drives our work. First, on how historical context informs that pathway to progress. In order to know the way forward, we have to understand the past and acknowledge its connection to structural barriers that persist today. Our economy was built on a legacy of disenfranchisement and discrimination against people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous communities. That included land theft, slavery, Jim Crow laws, and racial segregation. The structural barriers and socioeconomic disparities experienced by people of color today are inextricably linked to this history. Acknowledging our past, we must also accept the urgent moral imperative to achieve racial and economic equity, especially in the US. To this end, our standards are comprehensive and offer guidance for businesses seeking to fulfill the racial equity commitments made in summer of 2020. On the shifting perspectives and corporate roles in society. As we've all seen over the past few years, the moral imperative is aligned with widespread stakeholder demand. According to a 2021 PolicyLink study, almost 3/4 of Americans believe that eliminating racism is a goal we should try to achieve, And 60% of Americans think the best way to end racism is to pull together and address it rather than ignoring it. A recent Just Capital survey showed that 84% of Americans agree that companies often hide behind public declarations of support for stakeholders, but don't actually walk the walk. Our standards development effort is responsive to these stakeholder demands and to the growing movement of businesses proactively moving away from shareholder primacy and the pursuit of profits above all else. On the urgent need to improve sustainability performance. Most corporate efforts to advance equity require greater breadth and depth. Few companies have embedded equity in their business models and reporting, as they've done with other ESG-related issues. Companies also frequently tell us that they want and need more guidance on how to effectively advance their equity efforts. The absence of corporate performance standards on racial equity is also a distinct gap in the corporate standards landscape, despite unprecedented attention and resources devoted to social issues, as you'll see on the next slide. On this next slide is a view of the current ESG standards landscape. As you can see, it's large and complex. We found several great tools that support meaningful corporate action on racial equity. However, none are as comprehensive as the scope of the CEO Blueprint. Among the major standard settings organizations and ESG raters, we found very few disclosure frameworks or standards focused on racial equity. We concluded that comprehensive corporate performance standards on racial and economic equity, shaped by broad stakeholder engagement, are urgently needed, and that the Alliance can play a key role in filling this gap. Of course, we share the field's interest in driving consensus and building alignment. Our performance standards will flag similarities and connections to other tools and frameworks. We are also focusing on alignment in our implementation efforts, which we're going to discuss a little bit more later. Next slide, please. Our approach and standards framework builds on the foundation of the CEO Blueprint for racial equity. The Blueprint offers business leaders guidance on critical actions to advance racial equity across the enterprise, throughout the value chain, in communities where they operate, and across society. Think of the standards as the next evolution of the Blueprint. Each of the pillars and levers you see here are critical areas where we are developing performance targets for businesses. This is a huge effort that will call for sweeping change, from governance practices to human resources, operations, products and services, investments, communications, lobbying, and corporate philanthropy. Our Alliance is committed to clearly defining the breadth and depth of business shifts needed to achieve racial and economic equity across 360 degrees of business influence and impact. Now, I would like to transition to my colleague, AJ Scott, who will provide an overview of our development process. AJ?
Thank you, Ashley. Yes, I will provide a brief overview of our development process, and I'm excited to share our guiding principles, key findings from our research, and stakeholder engagement efforts to date. Next slide, please. We began our standards development journey in late 2020 by pressure testing the CEO Blueprint for racial equity with C-suite leaders across the nation. We explored their internal and external appetite for racial equity, their potential levers for change, and their greatest needs on centering equity and justice within their domains of influence. Our May 2021 report on corporate insights into the Blueprint summarizes our findings. I must note that the foundation of the Blueprint informs our standards development. And now along this timeline, we also researched the standards landscape and engaged various experts. Our current standards support that what's available for review and shares the key insights and resources we consulted and researched in 2021. I'm going to say that part one more time. So our current standards report that's available for review as of today shares the key insights and resources we consulted and researched in 2021. We also conducted a public survey to understand a broad stakeholder perspectives. So we've been on an intentional journey to get us to where we are today. So let's talk a little bit more about the public survey that I just mentioned. We asked, What is most important to you as we embark on this effort, and how might standards help you in your day-to-day work and community? We received more than 90 responses. That's about 40% from the private sector, 60% from people of color, and 97% from people in the US. The results showed that people want a uniform set of standards, and they most want those standards to influence corporations to prioritize racial equity, to improve corporate accountability for impacts on people of color, and to drive alignment on good corporate practices and disclosures on racial equity, with a special focus on corporate governance, HR policies, and worker power and voice. So based on these survey results, along with our research and values, we developed a set of 6 principles to guide our work and the creation of the standards. And these are our guiding principles in our work, which, starting with the first one, is achieving equitable outcomes and results. This means our performance standards will be ambitious and bold because they must address the root causes of racial inequity across the dimensions of corporate influence. So we're going to set the highest bar for equity in our standards, but within a framework for continuous improvement. We're also following equitable processes to achieve equitable results. This means having a standards development team led by people of color. This also means conducting robust stakeholder engagement that prioritizes the voices of the youth, people of color, especially members of the 100 million, to determine the substance and scope of the standards. Our third principle is about lifting up what works. We are innovating from the ground up, informed again by the expertise, wisdom, and resilience of people of color and low-income communities. Also, our performance targets and indicators will also align with the outcomes that the racial and economic equity movements have pursued for decades. And we're also championing transparency. Our standards development process will be transparent and open to all. Our standards will include robust assurance measures based on disclosure and transparency inside and outside the company. And our fifth principle is about building a tent and robust standards that will stand the test of time. We will capitalize on opportunities to harmonize metrics and frameworks. We are also breaking down silos through our partnerships around strategy, but we will not do so at the expense of achieving equitable outcomes or prioritizing the voice of stakeholders of color. We will map our indicators and performance targets where applicable to leading tools and frameworks that show how adoption of our standards builds on existing efforts or that fills a clear gap. And last but certainly not least, we are embedding accountability and processes and outcomes. We will embed accountability in the standards through assurance mechanisms that will support corporate accountability for achieving racial and economic equity outcomes. So we invite you to learn more about these principles that guide our work and our reports. Now I would like to transition to Mahalet to provide an overview of the scope and structure of our standards.
Thank you so much, AJ. And now the time has arrived. Let's get to our standard structure on the next slide. Grounded in the blueprint and our guiding principles, we're designing these standards around this structure. At the top, you see 10 racial and economic equity outcomes that all institutions, including companies, have a duty to contribute toward achieving. These outcomes that you'll see in the next few slides in a moment, they reflect the shifts that we need to see in order to really be living in that just, equitable, and healthy society where all people can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. With that overarching structure of societal outcomes, we've then developed 18 levers of change for companies to pull to fulfill their duty to contribute to those 10 outcomes. The levers of change that we'll walk through today, they map thematically to the 10 outcomes and the spheres of corporate influence outlined in the blueprint: company, community, and society, as well as the company's industry. That's a fourth area in recognition of the power of collective action. Now, the mapping that we have in the report between outcomes and levers of change, it's not intended to be mutually exclusive or substantively exhaustive. For each lever of change, there will be standards that include performance targets, interim targets, indicators, and metrics. The targets will set that high bar for equity. The interim targets will show milestones along the way, provide that first step forward. The indicators will show you what to look for, and the metrics will help us measure. Now, let's look at what these 10 outcomes are. And it starts really with a vision of the future. Imagine, just imagine a future free from racial and economic inequity, where all people enjoy a dignified standard of living for themselves and their families. They build generational wealth, live in healthy communities of opportunity, participate in fair democratic processes, and access what they all need to thrive as human beings. In order to get there, to that vision of the future, these 10 outcomes, it's split over 2 slides, they must become a reality. I'm just going to go over a few at a high level, and you all really, I invite you all to review this in detail in the report. You see the first outcome here is reckoning and repair, that all institutions proactively assess and acknowledge accountability for their contributions to racial injustice and actively repair harm caused. You see also outcome number 4, balanced power. People of color and working class people are proportionately represented in positions of power and leadership, and those most impacted by injustice are actually decision makers in the design and implementation of equitable solutions. Number 6, our democracy is vibrant and strong, and the nation benefits from the full participation of people of color, low-income communities, and young people in just and fair democratic processes. Let's look at a few more on the next slide. Outcome number 7, health, wealth, and well-being. People of color and low-income communities have equitable opportunities for quality education, career advancement, and good jobs with family-sustaining wages, generational wealth-building opportunities, and benefits, including access to high-quality healthcare. And the 10th outcome, narrative change. Finally, the brilliance, the beauty, and the humanity of people of color and working class people are celebrated in our nation's storytelling through culture, media, and marketing. Now, some of these outcomes, some folks might think, wow, this is really aspirational. How are we going to eliminate poverty? How are we going to close the racial wealth gap? How do we do all of these things? But in fact, many of the building blocks for this future, they're already in place. For all people to realize and fully enjoy it, though, we must focus on achieving racial and economic equity. We must include all of us in prosperity. The 10 outcomes thus encompass the shifts that we need to see to build a just and equitable society where all people can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. This is a world in which everybody belongs. It's a world where no one is left behind. And collectively, we know we have the resources, we have the skills, we have the expertise to achieve this within one generation. Of course, businesses play a smaller role in some of these outcomes and a larger role in others. And so now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kendra Berenson from FSG, to walk us through the specific levers that companies ought to pull.
Thank you, Mahalet. And that's right. The 18 levers of change describe the actions that companies must take in order to contribute to the societal level outcomes for racial and economic equity that Mahalet just shared. These 18 areas represent the ways that businesses can fulfill their duties and obligations to people of color, low-income communities, and society at large. The 18 levers are organized into 4 domains: starting with 10 levers that corporate leaders and board members need to pull within the company. For example, lever number 1 focuses on governance and leadership and states that equity is a core tenet of corporate governance embedded in the governing documents of the organization and the duties and responsibilities of all executive leaders and board directors. Lever number 3 highlights the importance of transparency and accountability in creating equitable companies. And lever number 5 gets right to the heart of it. The company's core business strategy incorporates and prioritizes racial and economic equity. On the next slide, we see the remaining company levers, which focus on the supply chain, worker voice and power, recruitment and advancement, compensation, and culture. We envision a world in which these 10 levers of change are embedded in the DNA of every company's operations. Next, we'll talk about these 4 levers of change at the community level. The community levers of change reflect the power of companies to make meaningful contributions in the companies where they operate. For example, lever number 13 focuses on companies' involvement in local policy. It states the company regularly assesses its policy positions with an equity lens and avoids advocating for local policies that reinforce racial and economic inequities. Within its spheres of influence, the company supports local policy changes that improve outcomes for workers, customers, communities of color, and low-income communities. We also recognize that collective action is a powerful force for long-lasting change. So the standards will describe actions that companies must take in collaboration with others in their industry. And finally, on the next slide, we see that there are 3 levers of change at the societal level, describing the duties companies have regarding their national political activity, marketing, investments, and communications. So, in communities, within industries, and across society, we envision a world in which these levers of change are embedded in the DNA of every company. Together, the 10 outcomes and 18 levers of change lay the foundation for setting new norms for equity in business. And within each lever of change, we will develop performance targets that set a high bar for equity, interim targets to support the journey, indicators to show the way forward, and metrics to measure progress. And I'm now going to transition back to Ashley to share more about how this approach will work.
Thank you, Kendra. To illustrate the output of our methodology, we share in our report 3 draft performance standards addressing components of equitable worker compensation, environmental justice, and contributing to a healthy multiracial democracy. As you'll see in the report, these sample performance standards aim to set the highest bar for equity, to define clearly what equity means and what strong performance on equity looks like, to ensure that organizations invest time and resources for the long term and allocate investments to the areas that will make a meaningful difference, and to ensure that the performance standards improve socioeconomic outcomes and shift power to members of the 100 million. Next slide. I'll now walk through the sample standard on equitable worker compensation. For the lever of change, our standard on equitable compensation for workers relates to lever number 9. All workers, including those who work part-time and on contract, are provided equitable compensation, including fair wages and benefits that enable workers and their families to thrive and build a future. You'll see further down the performance target that 100% of workers are paid at least a living wage. Yes, that's right. The bar for equity is for all workers. And we include in the definition of workers those on contract in addition to full and part-time employees. The interim target, let's say that a company is not quite at 100% yet. The interim target is to implement a board-approved plan to achieve and maintain at least a living wage for 100% of workers. Why this is important. So one of the strongest levers companies have to advance racial and economic equity is by raising wages. In America, millions of people, predominantly women and people of color, are working in the private sector for wages that are insufficient. The critical impact of wages on economic security, health, and wellness makes living wages highly material. Some other standards to be developed, we just want you to bear in mind, this is one target within this lever of change, and additional targets will be developed for this lever, including levers on pay equity and wealth building benefits. The report also contains detailed definitions, guidance, assurance measures, and a list of relevant tools and frameworks for each of these illustrative standards. Next slide, please. There are several key factors we're taking into consideration as we develop our standards, with an emphasis on intersectionality and time-based goals. While our performance standards focus on racial and economic equity, we recognize the importance of understanding the impact of intersecting identities, the intersection of racial and economic equity with other protected classes in the US, like sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, and age. In our next developmental phase, we will embed intersectional considerations into key standards. Some of the standards will also include time-based goals based on the criticality of the issue, company resources, and alignment with global goals that many companies are already working toward, such as the UN Sustainable Development Goals meant to be achieved by 2030. Next slide, please. We envision using a multi-pronged approach for implementing the standards, with a focus on how our standards overlay with other existing ESG standards. After publishing the draft of full performance standards, we will also pilot their initial implementation. The pilot will test the standards with a small cohort of companies that will commit to, among other things, sharing the data needed to assess and verify their performance, and convening a senior team to drive transformation within their company. We're about to share where we go from here and how you can get involved in shaping this work. I'll first remind our attendees that if you have any questions, feel free to add those in the Q&A box. AJ, over to you.
Thank you, Ashley. We hope you are as enthused as we are to bring this vision of equity to life. It's going to take all of us working together to strengthen this work in order to make it a reality. Over the next 60 days, from now until June 3rd, we invite you to lend your voice to this effort by sharing your feedback and ideas on how we can strengthen the scope and structure of the standards, as well as the 3 sample standards. You can get involved by joining one of our 11 virtual roundtables or taking our survey. Our standards site has all the details, including dates and registration links and how to prepare for the roundtables. And to recognize participants' valuable time and expertise in an equitable way, we are pleased to offer compensation to young people, people of color, individuals living on a low income, and others based in the US. So see our standards page for eligibility criteria. So what's next after the public comment period? We will analyze, synthesize, and incorporate feedback from the public comment period. We will then update our framework and draft the full set of performance standards. Throughout this period, we will continue stakeholder engagement and consultation on our standards development. We're also continuing to pressure test and explore various ways to implement our different approaches. In 2023, we expect to see the release of the full set of draft performance standards for public feedback. So get ready for another round of having your voice heard next year. We also aim to kick off a pilot with a small cohort of companies. Our report contains more details about each of these aspects of our work. We cannot emphasize enough how important it is for this work to be informed by broad stakeholder feedback. This effort is not about the alliance, but about the we, the collective action. So spread the word with your friends, your colleagues, and your networks, because your voices matter to us. And these are the types of questions we seek feedback on, such as, should we consider additional outcomes and levers of change in the scope of the performance standards? So we want to hear from all of you because your voice and your presence matter. Next slide, please. We thank you for spending this time with us and the insights you may share. We are building a big tent and invite everyone to join us by taking the next 2 steps and reviewing our report or deck, and then attend a virtual roundtable or complete an online survey. And we want to take this opportunity to thank our colleagues and partners who are on the journey with us, including our content partners who have provided tremendous wisdom and insight to strengthen our work. And that includes B-Lab, CAPIQ, Center for Sustainable Organizations, R3.0, the Global Impact Investing Network, Resilience Capital Ventures, the Pre-Distribution Initiative, the World Benchmarking Alliance, Imperative 21, and among so many others who have contributed. We also would like to thank our funders who have provided invaluable support, including the Ford Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Prudential, Conrad and Hilton Foundation, Walmart, and the Tipping Point Fund on Impact Investing. Thank you all again, and we're now ready to spend some time answering your questions. Ashley, over to you.
Thank you so much, AJ, and thanks again to all of our attendees for joining us today. Many of you have already submitted questions. Our team has been trying to answer some of those in the moment as they can, but I'm telling you, there's quite a few here. We're going to try our best to answer a couple today, and then also find other ways to answer these questions. So be sure to keep an eye on our website for more info, and we'll also be providing an FAQ to answer some of these questions a little bit later. Let's start with the first question, and maybe AJ, I'll start with you. This question is, why are you only focusing on the US to start?
Thank you, Ashley, for that question. There's a spiritual quote that says, get your house in order first. Our house is the US, and it is not in order. So before venturing into global expansion, our house must be in order. And there's a lot of reckoning and repair that needs to take place. The US has significant issues with racism that are incredibly urgent to address and have only been heightened dramatically over the past 2 years. Additionally, there is broad stakeholder demand for companies to stop perpetuating racial and economic inequities. There is also needed guidance to establish a common language to translate corporate commitments into equitable outcomes across all domains of a company's influence. And since the US is our home, it is an important testing ground to launch our corporate performance standards. And although our focus is on the US to start, we will still keep the global context in mind because the most powerful US companies are multinational, and systemic racism is a global issue. Lastly, we need to build our global expertise with broader relationships. So we welcome the support of global expansion. Please get in touch if you have that expertise.
Thank you, AJ, and we'll try to take a couple more quickly. Maybe Kendra, I'll send this question your way. How can there be a single standard for all companies given the variations across industries, company size, and resources, et cetera?
Great. I'm really glad this question came up because we want to make sure that both small businesses and large multinational companies see themselves in the standards. And so the standards will take into account and provide guidance on how companies of different sizes can meet the bar for equity. But that being said, it's important to note that companies of every size have a duty to contribute to an equitable society. And through our work, we aim to set a new norm that wherever you have influence, at whatever scale, you should prioritize equity. In addition, after developing the baseline standards for all companies, we will layer on industry and regional considerations, starting with the industries and regions where racial and economic inequity most affect members of the 100 million. This means that additional standards will be appropriate for certain industries and regions, but it should not deter any company from adopting the initial standards when we release them.
Thanks, Kendra. And Mahalat, I'm going to pepper you with 2 questions in a row. We'll do a little bit of a lightning round. The first one is, how will you make decisions about which targets to set, which industries to focus on, and which feedback to incorporate?
Thank you, Ashley. So, as we've mentioned throughout this presentation, we're focused on a very specific population. And that means that we need to see population level results in our work. And that's the guiding star in everything we do. The industries that we may focus on, it's going to be based on where the 100 million are at and where they're currently excluded. The targets that we set, it's going to be based on what will actually drive results, equitable outcomes for that group. And that's how we're going to be making decisions. It will be backed by data, but there are instances where we don't have the data yet because this is brand new work. It's incredibly emergent. And so we will also be informed by robust stakeholder engagement and primarily prioritizing the voices of people of color, working class people, those who are experiencing the barriers of systemic racism and economic exclusion. Those are the voices that really need to guide this work in how we set standards in the industries we focus on and how we know that we've actually achieved results.
Great.
Did I answer both or? Oh, okay.
I think that was one. And if you have time, we're going to try this one final one. Mahalat, I'll give this one to you, as I mentioned, which is, what role do you perceive consulting and audit firms to play in this work? How is it similar and different from other stakeholder groups involved? And maybe we'll end on that one.
Okay, sounds good. So there was one slide that we didn't get to see, but you all will get to see in the slides that are shared after this, and that is our stakeholder engagement slide, the slide that really shows an example of all the different groups that can get involved in this work. And I love this question because business advisors, audit firms, law firms, investment advisors, everybody has a role, and everybody, including those types of organizations, need to think about, how are our products and services lining up with these standards? How can we make sure we are supporting companies in achieving these standards? And that's the role that we see. And of course, any organization can use these standards to guide their equity journeys as well.
Wonderful. Thanks, fellow panelists, for answering those questions. And again, thanks to our attendees for asking such good questions. And like I said before, we're going to try to find ways to make sure we answer the other questions that were submitted that we didn't get time for today. So Michael, I will actually hand things back over to you to help close this out.
Thank you, Ashley. When you think about this work is generational work. And this work is about results. This is not a conversation about standards that resides on the political spectrum. This is an opportunity for this nation to continue to improve. And you'll hear a lot of things about the word equity, good and bad, in this nation, but this is why we've centered the 100 million. This is also why we've centered this invitation for every generation to accept the obligation to ensure that our democracy and our economy are strong and that they get stronger and more optimized for everyone in this nation. And this is a moment where we are creative enough, we're wealthy enough, we are innovative enough that we can see the humanity of everyone. It is no longer acceptable to believe that lifting up that 100 million requires us in some way to weaken our economy. We know we can do both. We've been doing both. Businesses have been showing us the way. In fact, we believe that businesses are on the leading edge of the equity movement. You are the apparatus to scale outside of government. You have a unique skill that is needed right now. You know how to bend the legal and regulatory frame of this nation, its laws, its regulations, its institutions, to your will. And we're asking you to be on a journey with us, to use those skills now, to make this economy stronger than it's ever been. And more important, to make sure that we're leaving no one behind. When we're successful, imagine Imagine folks not having to work 2 jobs and still being in poverty. Imagine the increase in productivity levels. Imagine the increase in GDP. So I want you to think about this as a results-based conversation. No matter where you sit on the political spectrum, the thing that I know to be true is this: that 100 million number is only going to go up if we don't do this work. And this work will be waiting for us, whether we do it today or we do it 50 years from now. So we know that the work is true. We know that our mission is true. And most important, we know that working with you is the best course to create a strong and vibrant democracy and economy. So what I'm asking is that you give the idea here a little grace, that you think about it, but that you don't think about it in traditional terms of whether this is a left idea, a moderate idea, or a right idea. I want you to think about this as a results-based idea. And we want you to ask yourself this question: what do members of your family in that 100 million need to fully move into the middle class and beyond? And how can these standards help them? We've been blessed to make it, so many of us. And now we have an obligation to finish ensuring that we can continue to be blessed as a nation by looking back, extending an arm, and helping others. So no matter where you sit on the political spectrum, don't try to situate this on it. Situate the 100 million. Abandon yourself to the strength of this network, and let's do what this moment requires for us to realize the promise of equity in our lifetime. Thank you for joining us today.